All right, let's kick things off. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are talking today about the Real Estate Developer's Guide to the Capital Stack. Can't have a more important conversation for commercial real estate players, particularly developers, than the capital stack. So, really excited to kind of dig in here today. I'm your host. My name is Kelsi Borland. I am a journalist. I've been covering the commercial real estate market for more than a decade. So, a lot of the information here is just my knowledge that I've gained over many, many years covering all different kinds of deals and deal structures, and also talking to a lot of kind of high level players, investors, developers in the commercial real estate market. And I'm excited to kind of share all of that with you today. So let's get started. Here's our agenda today. We're going to talk about what is the capital stack. There is a million articles that you can read online. We'll give you a quick overview of what the capital stack is, but we're going to dig a little bit deeper. We're going to understand those key layers of the capital stack. We're going to explore alternative financing options, which is very important for developers. We've really tailored this to developers. So we're going to look at what some of those alternative financing strategies and options are. We're going to talk about how you can build a strategic capital stack, and we're going to have some final tips for developers. If we have time at the end, we'll do a Q&A. There's a lot of information here and it's pretty dense. So we're going to hopefully have time for that, but we'll see. All right. So understanding the capital stack. This is, like I said, the real kind of cornerstone of commercial real estate. Really, if you're in any business, you need to put a capital stack together. But I think especially if you're in commercial real estate, because you're doing deal after deal after deal, your capital stack is never going to look the same. The capital stack, of course, is your capital structure. It is presented as a stack. We have the stack right here with senior debt on the bottom, mezzanine debt, preferred equity, and common equity. And I think it's kind of interesting to note that this kind of graph that you see all of the time with this higher risk, higher return at the top, lower risk, lower return at the bottom, this is really a demonstration for lenders, not for borrowers. I don't think borrowers think that senior debt is lower return. They're not really making a return on senior debt. They're paying it off. They're only making their return off of, obviously, off of the common equity, the equity that they've invested. So this is really kind of a demonstration for the lender side of the table. But of course, developers are also putting their capital stack together. So it's important to know how all of these tools work. We are going to look at this capital stack today from the borrower's perspective, much more than from the lender perspective. And a lot of the information you get often is from the lender perspective, or even maybe from an investor perspective of investors that are lending out capital to other kinds of players in the market. So this is really just the combination of capital structure, and it is critical for real estate developers to know this. And I have a video that I'm going to play on the next slide, because I think one of the important things to talk about here is that this is the capital stack today. It is not the way the capital stack has always looked, and it is not the way the capital stack is always going to look. So just 100 years ago, there were organizations called building and loans in the early part of the 20th century. And this was the most popular way actually to finance a home mortgage, or a regular kind of residential home mortgage, or to build a home. And basically what happened is that a small group of people who knew each other would get together. They would all put money together into a building and loan. They would form the building and loan, a little bit like a co-op. Today is probably the closest structure. They would put money into the building and loan, and then kind of one by one, they would build a house for themselves. Everyone would own shares in the building and loan, and the building and loan would own the homes. And the value of the building and loan was tied to the value of the homes. And the building and loan would also put debt on the houses so that it could round out its capital stack. This was the most common way to finance a mortgage in the early 20th century. I'm going to play a clip in the next slide from a movie called It's a Wonderful Life. Great movie if you haven't seen it. But it's about a man who owns a building and loan.
You're thinking of this place all wrong, as if I had the money back in a safe. The money's not here. Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And then the Kennedy house and Mrs. Maitland's house and 100 others. Are you lending them the money to build, and then they're going to pay it back to you as best they can? Or what are you going to do, foreclose on them?
I got $242 in here, and $242 isn't going to break anybody.
So that guy's the real villain of that story. But I love that clip because it really shows you how you really can think of 100 different ways to put a capital stack together. And that was the way they thought to do it in the 1920s. It worked actually really, really well and was incredibly popular. It's something like by 1930, more than 12 million Americans were members of a building and loan, and collectively they had $9 billion in assets. This is in the early part of the 20th century, the 1920s. So a huge amount in assets for that time. And so it really just shows you, the kind of evolution here of the capital stack. Really interestingly, as a side note, I will not get too deeply into this. You can always send me a message later and we can talk for hours about it. But building and loans actually collapsed during the Great Depression. That's why we don't have them anymore. And they were transitioned into savings and loans, which I think famously we all know led to the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s. So a lot of history there behind building and loan and savings and loan, but a really kind of interesting way to raise money, to put a capital stack together. And so today, I think at some point in time, you would have really just seen debt and equity on the capital stack. Today, we have more layers. I've even actually seen, I'm gonna do the capital stack with 4 layers, but I've actually seen some capital stacks with an extra layer for deeply subordinated debt. So even today, I think you see some evolution happening around the capital stack. So it's really, I think, important to keep in mind that there is a lot of flexibility in how you can put your capital structure together. So, like I said, we have 4 layers to the capital stack: the senior debt, mezzanine debt, preferred equity, and common equity. We have the definitions of each of these here, but I'm going to break each of them down as we go forward. But again, this kind of list is reversed. But if you go back to the slide I had earlier, it's really that like senior debt sits at the bottom, mezzanine debt, and then you have your equity instruments at the top. So let's go through them. Senior debt. Senior debt is your lowest downside risk financing instrument from the lender's perspective. It also is the lowest cost financing instrument because it is the lowest risk for the lender. This is going to be your lowest interest rate. Usually that rate's going to sit just above whatever the Fed funds rate is at. We did an interest rate webinar a couple of months ago, and so we talked a lot about how to price out your debt. And so this is kind of where you're going to get that lowest price point in your senior debt tranche. In 2024, mortgage rates are averaging kind of in the low 6% range, maybe even in the 7% range, and probably about there today as well. This is going to be your first funding source to be repaid following the close of an investment. And this is really kind of those key differentiators between each level of the stack, is who's getting paid first. There's a really great saying from lenders where they say repayment is always our best case scenario. So when you think from the lender's perspective, they're really structuring a deal to make sure they get their money back and they get the fee, which is their interest, that they are going to take to lend out that money, because their best case scenario is just that they're getting repaid. So senior debt is the lowest risk position because they are the first one to be repaid in the event that the investment goes south. They're also the first one to be repaid in the event that the investment is successful. And the kind of great thing about debt is that either way, the repayment doesn't change, right? So if you go into a development and you tremendously exceed your investment targets, you still only have to pay back what your original agreed upon amount was on your senior debt. You don't owe any more than that. Same on the flip side. If it doesn't go well, you still owe the money back. So senior debt is often collateralized, almost always by the project or by the property. And usually you have a loan to value in the 60 to 80% range. For developers, we're really looking more at a loan to cost, probably also in that range, but closer to 60%, maybe even dipping a little bit below that for a developer. There are lots of different types of senior debt. I think the most traditional type of senior debt is a bank loan, a regional bank, a local bank, a national bank. It doesn't matter. Bank loans are kind of the first place that you go to get senior debt. And then other places, Fannie and Freddie have construction to permanent loans. That's also going to sit in the senior debt position. I think famously, Fannie and Freddie will only ever sit in a senior debt position. They won't take on any risk. And so they have to kind of always be in that first repayment position. CMBS, which is a commercial mortgage-backed security, they do some construction financing too. These are actually a little more flexible around borrower terms, but actually have some strict servicing requirements. So these are also generally non-recourse loans on the CMBS side. And then I think it's important for a developer that lines of credit also can sit in the senior debt position. I think a lot of developers look at lines of credit to help round out their capital, or if they need additional capital along the way. And a line of credit will also sit in that senior debt position. So next we have next up in the capital stack is your mezzanine debt. Mezzanine debt is a really interesting kind of hybrid tool. It is a blend of debt and equity. And essentially it's sitting in that second repayment position. So senior debt's paid out first, then mezzanine debt. For that reason, it's a little higher risk for the lender and it's going to carry a higher interest rate as a result. But interestingly, mezzanine debt has some interesting features. You offer a pledge of equity on a mezzanine loan in case of foreclosure. That's actually how the lender can pull out any equity to get any of their money back. There are some really huge cases of mezzanine deals going south where an investor or developer put a lot of mezzanine debt on a project and the project didn't work out. And so there are a lot of examples online. We're not going to necessarily get into them here, but there are a lot of examples if you really want to go searching through it about kind of how mezzanine lenders have kind of tried to recoup some losses. And it's because they're in that pledge of they're in that second position, but they have a pledge of equity. And so they can really convert their debt into equity and pull out any equity they can from the project in case of a default. This is a subordinated loan to senior debt, and it's also an unsecured loan. So that's really important to note. Often these loans have recourse on them, but that is also project or property specific. So that's going to be deal to deal specific. You can have a non-recourse mezzanine loan that's possible. And again, they offer higher interest rates, usually 8 to 15% to kind of balance out the higher risk position. So that's your mezzanine debt. And I want to take a minute to kind of talk about the difference between senior debt and mezzanine debt. A lot of people actually look at mezzanine debt versus preferred equity, which we're going to get to next, because they're both in those kind of mid-tier and they're both hybrid instruments. But I think it's kind of important to know the differences between senior debt and mezzanine debt and why you might put mezzanine debt on a project in addition to senior debt. Like, why might that be important? So mezzanine debt, again, unsecured loan, which is collateralized by a pledge of equity. On the senior side, it's a secured loan that's collateralized by the property. Mezzanine loans can have a lot more flexible terms, and this is a key feature of a mezzanine loan. There's accrual repayment features. Those features are usually on construction loans also, which sit in a standard construction loan does sit in the senior debt position. But mezzanine loans also have accrual payment features, or some call it like in kind interest, and that really means that you can accrue the interest and then is added to the principal on the back end. So that you can preserve your cash flow. So it's a very important feature for developers who either aren't cash flowing on their property yet and don't have any cash flow, or have some cash flow and need to preserve it maybe to finish out a second phase of the property. You have an accrual repayment feature on mezzanine debt. So can be really important. A lot of times you'll see a construction loan in a senior position kind of backed by some mezzanine capital. Very common in real estate development. And then on the pricing side, you have that higher interest rate for mezzanine debt to balance out the security in the secondary repayment position. And then on the senior side, lower interest rate, and that it's a lower risk loan for the lender, which is why it's a little bit cheaper. But there are some opportunities here to kind of put the two different styles of debt together and really benefit from both of the kind of benefits here, right? So you're going to see usually the most debt is going to come on the senior side, but I think there are some benefits to putting some mezzanine on a property when it is appropriate. Great. So preferred equity, this is the second step. Sometimes you'll see the kind of the capital stack stacked as debt, and then those are your debt pieces, and then equity, and these are your equity pieces. I don't know that that's always accurate. I understand why you might do that, but preferred equity can also be structured a lot like debt. So we kind of see that here, the debt-like preferred equity and the equity-like preferred equity. Preferred equity is really, kind of in a partnership or management position. It's not the same as common equity, but it is just like equity, it's taking its profits from the success of the investment. So unlike the debt instruments, preferred equity actually is in a higher risk position because if the investment doesn't perform or doesn't perform as well as expected, the preferred equity repayment is going to change, right? But it's preferred equity because it's the preferred payment to common equity, which is the last repayment position. So preferred equity investors are going to get their repayment first before common equity takes their return. So another good way to think of it is that they're also could potentially be in a first loss position depending on how well the investment performs. So it is a hybrid structure that combines both debt and equity in the sense that it has terms like debt. It has predetermined fixed rate of return, and then you can see here whether it's kind of leaning more debt or leaning more equity. You can kind of change some of those terms, whether it's kind of in a priority repayments position, whether there's kind of fixed or undefined maturity rates, whether there's kind of more structure or less structure and some more flexibility around the terms. Those kind of all determine whether or not it's acting a little bit more like a debt instrument, a little bit more like an equity instrument. But either way, the repayment is going to be tied to the performance of the investment and the performance of the development. And I think that's really important to note. It's a popular alternative to mezzanine debt often because it does function a little bit more like equity. And even though it's higher risk from the lender's perspective, because it's again tied to the performance of the investment, for the investor, it actually is. It can be a more attractive benefit than mezzanine debt because it really is has more kind of profit sharing features. And so there's a little less stress, I think, to have that repayment at the end. Obviously, developers take on a ton of risk. So I think you're trying to kind of mitigate that throughout the capital stack. We can talk a little bit more about how to mitigate some of that risk through your capital structure in a little bit, but I think that's really what you're looking at when you see preferred equity. Again, I don't have a slide for it here. I really wanted to go over the difference in the two debt instruments between senior debt and mezzanine debt, but there is a lot of similarity between the way that mezzanine debt and preferred equity work as well. So kind of some opportunity to choose between the two. All right. And then common equity for the developer. This is your skin in the game. You know, everybody wants the developer or the investor to kind of have their own skin in the game. They want to know that they're also kind of sitting in a potential risk position as well. This sits in the last repayment position and it carries the highest risk, but also offers the greatest return potential, right? So everybody's sitting here. Well, actually, I don't know everybody, but I think a lot of the developers in the audience would probably be in that common equity position, right? If you have a deal, you're going out to market, you're putting the capital stack together. This is the money that you are bringing to the table to finance this deal. It represents the ownership, it represents profit participation once the project stabilizes, and you're really in that control and driver's seat, making those decisions along the way about the development, about any construction, any exit plans, and kind of where the budget is headed. All of those decisions sit in the owner's seat, so you're really driving the bus here. You're kind of responsible for the outcome of the investment, which is why you're in the highest risk but greatest return potential position. Let's talk a little bit about building a strategic capital stack. So I think these are some great visuals here because again, you can put any capital stack together that you want, like we discussed earlier. It doesn't have to be all four of those layers, and you can also create the capital structure that works the best for you. There are some really great quotes about capital structure. Michael Milken, who's kind of one of the people to establish the high yield bond market, he has been quoted as saying that it doesn't matter if you have a big business or a small business, your capital structure is always the most important component of your business. It always matters. And there are a lot of investors who have attributed their success to their capital structure or putting the right type of capital structure together. So it's not one way, it's not one path forward. It's really looking at all of your options and deciding what works best for your investment strategy. So I really wanted to look at some of these different options. Let's say you go out to market, you have a deal, and you go shopping for a senior debt loan first, which I think is often what is recommended. Kind of need to know how much debt you can put on a project or what you're going to get pricing wise before you can know what other capital components you need or how much equity that you're going to need. So let's say you go out to market, you get 60% senior debt for your project. Maybe you have the other 40% in cash. You want to keep it simple. it's you know what you're doing, you know what you want, you want to have this very simple capital stack. This is great. You'll have this simple capital stack on the side. You only have senior debt with 40% equity. Let's say you don't have 40% equity, right? Let's say you go out to market and you get the 60% and you think, oh my goodness, I only have 20%, right, to round out this capital stack. So then you're going to go maybe put 10% mezzanine debt and 10% preferred equity. Or maybe you're going to go put, maybe you have 25% and you don't want any other mezzanine debt. You don't want that instrument. Maybe you have some investors that maybe you've done a deal with some investors before. And so you have some preferred equity that you can put into the deal as well. And so you round out with 15% preferred equity, and then your capital stack will look like this structure on the right. I also want to say that it doesn't have to be that you just don't have the 40% equity. You could go out to market and think like, okay, I have enough capital to put 40% into this deal, but I don't want to. I want to diversify my capital stack because I want to retain 20 or 15% of this equity. I want to retain this cash in case I have overages, in case my timeline is off, right? I can be the person to infuse more capital into this project if I need to. I don't have to put all my capital in and then go back out to market if I need more capital later on. That could be a risk mitigation strategy. You could be somebody who thinks, if I can get 60% senior debt on a deal, I'm definitely going to put 10% mezz and 10% preferred equity on it, because I'm going to take that other 20% now and go have a capital stack that looks identical to this: 60% debt, 10% mezz, 10% preferred equity, and 20% common equity. I'm going to take that other 20% that I have and I'm going to do a second deal. So now I have two deals with identical capital structures, and I can increase my return profile that way, because now I have two deals and I can put capital to work in two places. So that's another option. There are a lot of reasons why you might choose these different capital stacks. And so it's really important not just to think like, I think there's two ways to think about this. The one way is to think like, I need the money to make this deal work, right? And again, it's very expensive, as everyone in this audience knows, to build a commercial real estate building, any size, any type of projects. It costs a lot of money, and it's a speculative game with a lot of risk. So just cobbling together enough money to do this might require a complicated capital stack. But if you're in a position where you could have had a simple capital stack, you might want some of these tools just to mitigate risk in a different way. So it's really about looking at your investment strategy. It's looking at your own internal capital and putting the best capital structure together for you that will make the deal work. A lot of that has to do with how much money you have. It also has to do with what pricing is like in each of these tranches, right? If you're getting great pricing on senior debt, maybe you want to put some more expensive capital on the project just because you can afford to. And again, you can put money to work somewhere else. There are a lot of reasons. So it's really sitting down with your capital professional and deciding the structure that's right for you, the structure that's right for the project. I love those different capital slides. I've also seen some, before we move on, online, where I think it's important to note that if you kind of boost some of your leverage, you can kind of boost your return profile, right? Because you've put less cash into the deal, so it increases kind of the amount of return versus the investment. But there's also kind of some risk, I think, in over leveraging yourself. So it's important to kind of know. It's important to know what your deal looks like, what kind of risk you want to take on, what your exit strategies are before you put your capital structure together, or while you're putting your capital structure together, rather. All right, alternative sources of capital. This is ways to expand your capital options. So I think the really great news is that for developers, there are actually a lot of different funding tools. A lot of people really realize the benefit of having real estate development, housing development. I think especially tons and tons of opportunities around housing development. But I think that, there are a lot of pro-business government officials out there who really understand the benefits of development, and they have created a lot of different types of programs and alternative capital sources for developers to tap into to kind of help pay for a project to be done. So I'm going to go over, again, there are a ton. I'm going to go over three that I think are really, really important. They're tax credits, the EB-5 visa program, and then crowdfunding, which actually isn't necessarily or is definitely not a government funding tool, but it is an alternative tool to kind of raise money. So I think all of these are really interesting opportunities, and they can kind of help to bridge gaps, funding gaps, and reduce costs. So let's start with the EB-5 program. For those of you who don't know, the EB-5 program has been around for decades. It's a visa program where you can actually partner with a foreign investor in exchange for them to come here and get a visa for them and their family. They can get permanent residency status. So it's very, very, very popular. It's a fast track way to get permanent residency in the United States, which is very valuable. And so the way that it works is kind of simply that somebody applies to this program, the developer can apply through the program, they'll be paired with a foreign investor, and then that foreign investor can, will fund the project or provide some funding for the project. Usually they sit in kind of that mezzanine debt position. Their capital is usually structured as debt. It could potentially sit in a preferred equity position, but usually it would be a more debt-like preferred equity tool, but usually sits in that mezzanine debt. And so it is structured as an interest-only fixed-term loan. Usually it supports large-scale developments. And the kind of goal of the program is job creation. So there are some strict requirements around the amount of capital that needs to be invested into the project and the amount of jobs that the project needs to create. It is at least 10 full-time jobs. I don't think that that's very difficult on most developments, but that's kind of the baseline requirement. And then there's some baseline requirements, really depends on the project, for how much capital needs to be invested, minimum capital amounts that needs to be invested. This is a great opportunity to tap into alternative financing source, and there's actually a lot of demand for it. So if you haven't seen this or utilize this, there are some developers who kind of exclusively use EB-5 funding and really understand kind of the ins and outs of the way to navigate through this, how to get the funds. It can be a little slow to get these funds. You really have to work that into your timeline, but it's really a great opportunity to kind of tap in to an additional capital source and really get some good funding to fill out your capital stack. So that's the EB-5 program. It's a visa program, once again. Tax credits. I think we should do a whole webinar one day on tax credits, because I think this has to be the kind of big key for commercial real estate developers, is tapping into different tax credits. If you're in affordable housing, LIHTC, low income housing tax credits are kind of your number one source of capital. There's different amounts that you can tap into, different funding requirements through LIHTC. There's the historic tax credit for historic renovations. There are opportunity zones, which were tax credits that were established during President Trump's first administration. So a lot of those, I think, might be coming to maturity soon. They had a 10-year timeline on them, and there were designated opportunity zones across the country that if you developed in these opportunity zones, you kind of got this tax credit. And then there are new market tax credits. That's that last one for markets that are identified that need kind of additional investment, additional development. And there are tax credits for those markets as well if you're developing in them. There's a real potential for savings with a tax credit. They are a government incentive that are meant to promote economic development. But the real benefit here is that they reduce the tax liability dollar for dollar. So this is not a tax deduction. This is a dollar for dollar reduction in your tax liability. And we put some of the savings here on the side. I think, some of these, like the new market tax credits, historic tax credits, have up like a 40% reduction in construction costs. So real savings for developers if you're utilizing those tax credits. LIHTC has a little bit more moderate tax savings. There's a 4% and a 9% LIHTC credit, and LIHTC was just refunded under President Biden. But most affordable housing developers will tell you that they cannot put a deal together without some LIHTC money. It's really essential to making those deals work. There are, of course, kind of guidelines or features that you have to comply with under each of these tax credits to get this money. But a lot of developers, I think, might be close to doing this anyway. So it's really important to look. And again, this is not at all a comprehensive list of the tax credits. There are many different tax credits that are offered kind of at different levels of government, right? So local municipalities will offer, or small city governments will offer their own tax credits. States have tax credits. Then there are federal tax credits. So it's kind of important to know who's offering tax credits, and what they are, to see if you can tap into any of this money. Actually, tax credits sit in the equity position. They're an equity infusion into. They kind of maybe sit between common equity and preferred equity, but they're an equity infusion into the capital stack, and there's no repayment required, right? It's just kind of a tax credit money that you're getting. So really, really beneficial to add some of this funding into your capital stack. And then crowdfunding. Crowdfunding is relatively new. It's emerged in the last 10 or 15 years. There was an SEC regulation, the Jobs Act, that kind of came through, allowing crowdfunding to happen, because you really, they kind of allowed developers to market, or investors to market deals or projects online to pool funding. The way that crowdfunding works is that you can basically, through a crowdfunding platform, an investment crowdfunding platform, you can post a project, a development, an investment, and people can, donate any amount of money. It depends on the platform, but any amount of money to the project. This is a really innovative and interesting way to raise capital. The capital can be structured as either debt or equity. It'll usually sit in that mezzanine position or in a preferred equity position, depending on how it is structured. But the benefit of this is that either accredited or non-accredited investors can invest in a crowdfunding platform. Some crowdfunding platforms will exclusively work with accredited investors, and some will kind of open their gates up to different types of investors. Those different platforms will have different types of projects that they're willing to work with. But either way, depending on your deal, depending on the size of the project and how much money you need, this can be a really exciting opportunity to tap into a pool of investors that maybe you otherwise would not have been able to tap into, and really kind of round out your funding source in this way. This is especially interesting if you have a project that has a really great story to it, because you're marketing the deal, right? So if you have a project that has a good story, a project that you really have an interesting business plan for, or an interesting exit strategy, this is a really great tool that you can use, I think, to kind of reach out to people and say, go on this journey with me and kind of invest in my project. So a really exciting tool to use as well. Also wanted to talk about rescue capital. Like we said, developers take on a tremendous amount of risk. They often are building speculative projects. And so sometimes things don't go as planned, and you can infuse rescue capital into your project. It's really a safety net for developers. It's obviously not something that anyone plans to do, but I think that it is something that can happen over a timeline. This often happens if there's an increase in, for example, if you had a floating rate loan and interest rates increased, you might not be able to afford to maintain the loan, and you might need rescue capital. Also, if just the project falls into distress for another reason, if your timeline is off, these are all reasons that you might need to infuse rescue capital. Typically, if you're going to go out to market and look for rescue capital, you will need to have a pretty solid plan in place for how you're going to use that capital to get the project back on track. But there are distressed investors who will infuse capital into a struggling project to make it work, just as long as there is a plan in place to kind of use those funds in a strategic way to kind of get the project back on track, and also still perform. Now you have another lender to repay. So it's really important to have that plan in place and make sure that the property is going to perform if you're putting rescue capital onto your deal. I think the really important thing to note about rescue capital is, like we talked about earlier, the capital stack is also evolving. It can also evolve alongside your project, right? Nothing is set in stone. So if you need rescue capital, if you need to go back to a lender and have a conversation about the deal that you have, or the terms, or the way your capital structure works, go have that conversation, right? I think everybody wants you to be successful, especially if they've given you money. Everyone wants you to be successful. So I think having a lot of transparency within your capital stack and understanding what kind of money you need, where that money needs to go, all of those are really important features and conversations that you should be having with all of your capital providers and kind of providing that amount of transparency. Great. Real world strategies for developers. So when you're putting a capital stack or capital structure together, there are some kind of practical tips. So we kind of put this model together. This isn't necessarily set in stone, but I think you can often rely more heavily on equity because you have the cash during your pre-construction phase. A lot of times often developers will work in phases because development is so long, right? And you need to buy your land or you need to secure your development site. You need to put construction on a project or a construction capital on a project or construction loan. And then you need to kind of move through that stabilization period. And usually what's going to happen is there are going to be capital stacks or an evolving capital stack that works with you through each of these phases. And some of those might look like pre-construction might be a little bit more of your equity partnerships. Your construction phase might be leaning more on your debt partnerships. And in a post-stabilization phase, you're going to really be looking at what your exit strategy is here. And that might be just exiting the property and paying off the loans that are maturing. That might be refinancing into some longer term debt if you're going to hold on to the property through stabilization. So there needs to be some flexibility here in the capital stack. And you need to understand that the capital stack is going to change. It's going to change as you complete construction. It's going to change as you enter construction. And that is absolutely normal and essential. And it's going to be a long conversation over putting a capital stack together on a development project. There are some things that I think are important to note. One of those is that most capital providers will recommend that when you come out to market, you really need a loan book when you come out to market and a project book, and you need a source of use funds document. So you really need to have put together your budget on the project, and so that you know how you're using that money and exactly what it's going to be going to. You also need your business plan put together. If you have renderings on a project, that's great to bring out to market. Having as much information as you can on a project is really going to help you put your capital structure together. And I think it's also important to note that all of the different players in those 4 layers in that capital stack know about each other. There are no hidden loan terms. There are no hidden buckets of money somewhere. Your mezz debt knows that you have senior debt. They know how much debt you have. They know what the terms on that debt is. And that's why they can plan their kind of structure accordingly. Preferred equity knows the rest of the capital stack as well. And so it's really important to make sure that you have all of the tools available to you to show everyone that you're transparent, to show everyone that you have your business plan in place when you're going out to market and shopping for all of these loans and putting that capital structure together. So this is kind of the way that it flows through on a development. Very practical, but kind of essential to kind of see those different steps. And then final tips for developers are really about building strong banking relationships, diversifying your funding sources, creating a model for different capital stack scenarios, and then staying flexible to adapt your approach. And I kind of want to talk about each of these. First, building strong banking relationships. You hear this a lot. Everybody kind of talks about this, to lean on your banking relationships. And I just want to remind everybody here that a banking relationship can just be the bank that you bank with. It can be a bank that you have a banking account with or a business account with. It doesn't have to be a bank that you've had the exact same deal with before that's capitalized your entire development. Banks are always going to give preference to their current customers, even if that customer is just somebody who has a business bank account with them. So I think there can be some confusion about that. And I just wanted to, I always like to clarify that, to go to your bank, go to the place where you bank. You do have a banking relationship, even if you think you don't have a banking relationship. Diversify your funding sources. We talked a lot about that already, but that's really just about making sure that you're mixing debt and equity and all of these alternative capital sources to really create resilience in your capital structure, to protect yourself against downside risk, and to make sure you've built the best capital structure for you. And part of that is modeling multiple capital stack scenarios. So really important to sit down with your capital provider and go through all of those different capital structures that we talked about earlier. How much debt are you putting on the property? What kind of risk does that create? How much equity are you infusing? Do you need to infuse as much equity as you are? Are there different alternative sources? How much is how much is the cost of capital over the whole stack, over the term of the project. Knowing all of these, having all of these questions answered can make sure that you're putting the best capital stack together for you, for your project. And stay flexible and adapt your approach on a project, adapt your approach along the way. Capital's, essential to making the project work. Everybody wants you to be successful. And so kind of really important to make sure that you're staying flexible too, and you're understanding that there are different ways to make a project work. You don't need to walk into a bank and say, like, this is what I want, right? Sit down and have that conversation and see how you can work together, how you can piece different parts of capital together. And one last tip that I'm going to mention that isn't on here is that I think that it's also important for you to understand the way your capital structure is working as you're going out to different partners and selling them on infusing capital into the stack, right? When you go to a preferred equity partner, if you go to a government agency and you're trying to get tax credits, for example, if you're going to different investors looking for partnerships, they're going to want to know not only what your capital structure looks like, but also that you understand your capital structure and the benefits and risk implications within that structure. That is really going to help people believe in you, believe the capital structure is going to work, and kind of back the deal and put more money into the deal. It's a really important part of putting your capital structure together is kind of understanding how the deal is going to work and how all of these different components are going to fit into the deal. And of course, how everyone is going to get repaid at the end of the investment. So very, very important. I want to thank everybody so much for taking the time to join me today. Your capital structure and your capital stack is so important to your deal. And it really seems like it's a very simple structure, but it can be very complicated and it can be very intimidating if you're just starting to put a capital stack or capital structure together. So I want to thank everyone for taking the time. If you have any questions, please feel free to email them to the Northspire team, and someone on the team or me will be happy to answer them. Thank you again. Have a great day.